All right, total depravity. What in the world is total depravity? Okay, good. Another phrase or term for that would be original sin. What does that mean? When somebody says, I believe in total depravity, humanity is totally depraved, what are they saying? What are they teaching?
We're born in sin because of Adam and Eve.
Exactly, yeah. Basically that Adam and Eve's sin is inherited all the way down through mankind. And when we are born, we're immediately born not into a sinful world, although that's true, but in sin. We're immediately a sinner when we come out of the womb, or some would argue the very moment in which we are conceived. Letter A there, total depravity, otherwise known as original sin, and it's the basic belief that babies are born in sin. And of course, this is why many participate in what kind of baptism? Infant. Many believe that infants need to be baptized for that reason. At least they got that part right in the sense that baptism is what will wash away their sins. However, we're going to study this at another time, but how do they normally go about doing that baptism? Do they immerse the baby? No. Sprinkling, which is not a biblical mode, of course, of baptism. The very word means immersion, the baptizo. It's a transliteration of that word. And so we'll study that more in time. Yes, sir.
Before you get away from that, how many different denominations use that sprinkling of babies?
So, well, there's at least several.
I didn't understand that until I started studying on it a little bit.
Yeah, Catholic would be one of the main ones that do that. I know some Methodists that are involved with sprinkling. Lutherans, that's right. Presbyterians believe in total depravity. Pretty much anybody that believes in the Calvinistic tulip, that follows the teachings of Calvin, probably will participate in infant baptism. That is the T, by the way, in the tulip. If you've heard of the tulip, the T stands for total depravity. That's a Calvinistic idea, and a lot of denominations buy into that. But not one tenet of the tulip is biblical. But again, that would be a good study to have too in the future. But letter B there, babies do not sin by being born. So the belief is that their sin is what from Adam? Larry just said it a moment ago. Inherited. Very good. Inherited. All right, we're going to begin with arguments that are in favor of total depravity. In other words, arguments these different denominations, the religious world, use to teach that total depravity is biblical. There are some passages that might give some credence to that idea, at least in their minds. And so we need to be prepared, first of all, to know these passages and be prepared to give an answer or to change our minds if the Bible does teach total depravity. We know that's not the case, but let's see why. Genesis 8 and verse 21 is where we'll begin. Genesis 8 and verse 21. Someone read that for us when you get there. Genesis 8 and verse 21.
And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done.
Excellent. The imagination of man's heart is evil from his what? Youth. And so the argument is, well, if his imagination is evil from his youth, that would indicate then that even as a baby, as a young youth, he's going to have evil intentions. And so babies are born sinners. What do you think? Is that what that passage is teaching? No. Why not? How do we know that that's not evidence of total depravity? What is he saying? We always need to know the context. We need to know what he is saying. We can't just push it to the side and say, well, it's not that, and move on. What is he saying here? What's the context? He's referencing what? What happened that he's kind of referencing back to? Okay, good. I heard several things, but the flood, exactly. He's referencing what took place before the flood. Now, first of all, you see here on your worksheet, this Greek word excuse me, not the Greek word, I'm jumping ahead. First, the term youth, rather, the letter I. The term youth is very relative or subjective, you might put there. Youth is a relative term. True or false, a 2-year-old is a youth. Yes. True or false, a 14-year-old is a youth. True or false, Timothy, who was probably in his early 20s, was referred to as a youth. Absolutely. So youth is very relative. Does God mean a baby here? Not necessarily. In fact, I would argue not at all, because he's referencing again what happened before the flood. Now, notice here, secondly, he's referencing the evil which was brought about from the flood, Genesis 6 and verse 5. Now, true or false, man's thoughts before the flood, man's thoughts were already or originally evil. They were not influenced to be evil. Okay, good. False. That's false, isn't it? Look over here with me. Let me show you what I'm referencing. Genesis 6, 2 chapters earlier. Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2. When we see God talking about the thoughts of man being evil continually and that He's going to destroy the world, it's not until after this takes place. Genesis 6 and verse 1, it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Why was it, and ladies, we talked about this in ladies' class a while back, why was it that these godly men, sons of God here referencing faithful men, why is it that they were drawn away into sinfulness? Why did their thoughts become evil?
Because the women were pretty.
Okay, because the women were, if a woman's pretty, you're bound to be, we're all in trouble then, aren't we? Because the women were pretty, and what did that mean? What were the men doing?
Lusting.
They were lusting after these beautiful women. And so they decided to give themselves to these women, and what happened? After they did this, when they decided to keep company with these women, to be with them, what happened to the men's faithfulness?
It went away.
Okay, good. It went away. It faltered, right? Okay, here's the point. At what point were the thoughts of all these people evil? It wasn't until, as adults, these men were influenced with that negative example of these women. And so they were enticed to sin. They followed their fleshly desires. And it's with that he says in verse 3, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And then verse 5, God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Notice, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That statement came after these women influenced these men to have these evil thoughts. And so there is in no way, shape, form, or fashion evidence in Genesis 8 verse 21 that babies are born sinners. That's just not at all what God is saying there. What about Ephesians 2? Any thoughts? Any other thoughts or comments on that particular point? All right, let's go to Ephesians 2 and look at another argument. Ephesians 2. Somebody read verse number 3 when you get there. That's willing.
Among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others.
Excellent. Notice here, they were by nature children of what? Wrath. The blank there, wrath. They were children of wrath, and so here's the evidence. Here's where the Bible teaches original sin. All right, what do you think? Is that evidence for it? No? What I mentioned earlier, and this was what I was jumping ahead, this is where that Greek word comes in. The Greek word phusei, how we would spell it in English language, phusei, can denote something which became nature by habit. That's important. In other words, this word doesn't necessarily mean that they were children of wrath by nature in the sense that they were born that way, but they created it or made it their nature based upon habit. That can also be the case. We don't know for sure which one it is, but just on the offset, just that very word doesn't necessarily denote they were born that way. But nonetheless, regardless, does anybody, by the way, have the American Standard Version of 1901 with them tonight? Oh, I was counting on somebody having it. That's all right. Verse 1, it's a great translation, or a version of the Bible. Verse 1, read it with me, Ephesians 2:1. And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. The ASV puts the word there, your trespasses and sins, which is what the Greek is implying. In other words, the sins of the people here are personal. Your personal sins. That's the blank there. Secondly, the sin is not inherited here. Right? There's no reference to an inherited sin. It's their personal sins that they're committing. And because of those personal sins, Paul references them as being children of wrath. What do you think really Paul is getting at here in this context? What does he mean by them being children of wrath?
They went against God's teaching, against the Spirit that God put in them. They went against that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think Paul is literally calling them children here? Are these people he's talking to children? No. So that would probably make this what type of language? The children of wrath.
Figurative.
Yeah, kind of a figurative statement to make a point.
But they had to know the difference in right and wrong. They had to know what God had done to create things. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
We got to turn it off.
That timing, right as he was talking.
We got to turn it off. But the idea is that a baby doesn't know right from wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in your formative years, you learn right from wrong according to God's will. And that's when you become children of wrath. It's not before you know the difference. And like the age of accountability.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
We'll use that. But it has to be that you know what's going on, as we learn from the New Testament, that we have to know what's going on when we're baptized.
Right, absolutely. And we're gonna talk more about that in the second section. But yeah, that's exactly right. You've got to know what's right or wrong, and that's where that age of accountability comes in, is having that knowledge. And these babies don't. But this language here, children of wrath, again, it can be talking about a habit that was created, and certainly a figurative phrase there that Paul's using. Yes, ma'am.
They have to also be old enough to fulfill the desire.
That's right.
Of the flesh. I mean, they have to, of course, be advanced enough to imagine, and then they have to fulfill it.
That's exactly right.
Fulfilling the desires of the flesh.
Yep. Children, babies can't do that. They can't do that. That's exactly right. But Larry, yes, sir.
The we there refers to who he was writing to, not to children.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Who is he writing to here?
He says we are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Who's he referencing by the we? The church at Ephesus. That's right. The church at Ephesus. And when he uses that word we, that would also include who? Himself. That's right. Who is the he here? Who's writing this? Paul, the Apostle Paul. Certainly he's not a child. And again, we're going to see a little bit more about this figurative concept of children of wrath in a moment. But before we get there, I want to go to Romans 3. Romans 3. Here's another passage, and this one's probably maybe the more simple of the group. I don't think it will take long at all to know exactly what Paul is getting at here, but Romans 3 and verse 10, very short passage, if someone will read that one for us.
What then? Are we better than they? No. In no wise, for we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that we are all under sin.
Trying to find where that was at. I can't find it. Look at. Oh, there you go. Okay.
There is none righteous, no, not one.
Well, that was good though. Verse 9 helps us with the context. That's good. I knew that sounded familiar. What are we talking about here? When Paul says there's not one that's righteous, no, not one. Yeah, that's all he's saying. Very simple. Everybody has sin in their life. No one is righteous. Right? If this was literal in the sense that there is no such thing as anyone who is righteous, what would that imply?
Everybody's perfect.
If nobody is righteous, nobody at all.
There's no sin in the world.
Okay, good. Yeah, not even Jesus was righteous, right? There's no sin in the world. Well, this is, in this case, nobody is righteous. So they're all in sin. They're all lost. And it kind of goes with Romans 3 and about 13 verses later, verse 23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But as he read just now in verse 9, which actually was very helpful, what is Paul referencing? When he says no one is righteous or all have sinned, he's technically referencing the who and the who here, the Jews and the Gentiles. That's the context. When he's using that word all or in verse 23 or here in verse 10, there is not one. He's referencing Jew and Gentile. He's dealing with these Jews who believe that they had it better, right? They're better off than the Gentiles because they're God's chosen people. And this mindset he constantly had to deal with. And so he's telling them it's not the case. It's just not the case. Nobody is righteous. You're all in sin. You've all got to make this right. You just as much as the Gentiles. And that's what he's dealing with. But let's go to Psalm 51 because this is, in my experience, the most used, most argued, and probably the best one to try to argue that there is original sin taught in the Bible. Psalm 51:5 as well as 58:3. These two are used hand in hand. Psalm 51 and verse 5 to begin with, though. David, writing this, says what in verse 5? Someone that is willing to read it. Psalm 51:5.
Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me.
Very good. In sin did my mother conceive me. What does that imply? Original sin. He's talking about a baby. I was conceived in sin. And so there's the argument. Well, that's the best one there is, right? That teaches total depravity. Before we answer it, look also, maybe put a marker there or your finger. Psalm 58 and verse 3 says, the wicked, this is David again, the wicked are estranged from the womb, they go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. As soon as they're born, they go astray. And so you see this concept. Now, what is David talking about in Psalm 51? What is Psalm 51 about? This is a fairly popular psalm because David is in what state of mind here? He's penitent, exactly. What is he referencing here? He's penitent of what?
The sins that he has committed.
That's it.
That he's led.
That's it. All the things that you read about in 1 Samuel 12, and you talk about Bathsheba and Uriah, all of these sins that have been in David's life, he's penitent about those things. He's completely feeling that he is in sin, he's in sorrow, and so he writes these words, behold, I was shapen in iniquity. Now, for the first point here that I want you to notice is that in Psalm 51 in verse 5, he says that he was conceived or born in sin. Conceived, all right, the blank there. Psalm 51, he was conceived in sin. We know what conception is. In Psalm 58 in verse 3, he says that he's in sin at what point? Conception or birth? Birth. Psalm 58 and verse 3, birth. So we've already got a problem here because in one case David says, I was conceived a sinner. And in another case he says, I was born. I was led astray when I was born. And that's when I was in sin. Also keep in mind, and I'm going to hopefully make this clear in a moment, but also keep in mind that the Psalms that you're reading are what type of writing? What do you call these? In the Bible they are classified as what? Poetry. It's poetry. What do you know about language in poetry? It's a lot of figurative language. That's right. Is it possible here that David feels that he's so sinful that he might figuratively say that I was just born this way? I'm just filthy. I've been a sinner from the beginning, and he might use this figurative language? Sure, that's a possibility. If you need more evidence of that, Psalm 58 and verse 3 says that when he's born, he goes astray. What are the last two words of that verse? Speaking lies. How many of you ever had a child that was born, and as soon as that child came out of the womb, they started speaking? That's right. They'd be lying about that. That's just not going to happen. So is David literal here when he says, I was born astray, speaking lies? No. When did he speak lies?
As soon as he knew he was lying.
Yeah, as soon as he knew what a lie was. That's exactly right. Exactly. David is not being literal here. He's using poetic language. When I went astray, I was speaking lies. Could David speak as an infant? No, of course not. Yes, sir.
But you have to keep in mind that David was fair in the eyes of God.
That's right.
For a portion of his life, his youth, up until he fell.
That's right.
The devil got to him.
Yeah, he definitely did. He definitely did, many a times.
Prime example of how strong David was to begin with in his life, and then he fell away, and now what's he doing? He's saying, man, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't want to live this way.
That's exactly
And
right.
it's a prime example for our responding when we have sin in our lives and get prayers of the family here.
Yeah. You're exactly right.
Prime example.
David is in that state. He's very penitent. He's very sorrowful for that sin. And he's pouring it out in these words. Also, by the way, before we move on, you see the finally here, suggesting David inherited his mother's sin is to suggest blank inherited his mother's sin. Someone mentioned this earlier. Who would therefore have to have inherited sin if David and everybody else does? Who was born of a woman that was never in sin? Jesus Christ. Do you really want to talk about the ramifications or to imply that we inherit sin from our mothers? Because in fact, in Psalm 51, does he reference, who does he reference in verse 5? His mother or father? His mother. And this is a prime example. Because based on this passage, if you want to argue their best text for original sin is this one. And he's talking about getting it from his mother. Right? If you want to talk about, let's say, for example, let's just pretend this is teaching original sin inherited from mama. That would therefore say or imply that Jesus inherited it from his mother, because that would teach that that's how that process worked. And of course we know that's not the case. Certainly not the case. Anything else though on that before we go to the text that would disprove original sin? Yes, sir. Yeah, Catholics, and I guess, with any group, you're going to, everybody kind of, you may talk to a Catholic who doesn't, but for the most part, their teachings are that Mary was without sin.
What about Mary's mother, though? What about her mother? She would have had to inherit her mother's sin.
I've never asked somebody who believed that question.
Mary was conceived like Jesus was conceived. It was an immaculate conception.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
Mary's mother was very old in age when she conceived of Mary.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that. And then you go back to the next one. Well, then what about her? You keep going in the line. Eventually, they're going to have to say, well, that one was a normal birth. Well, what happened to the sin there? But that's a great question. That about sums it up, I guess. But anything else? All right, let's talk about. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can you go back and tell us
Yes.
what the answer to the
Psalm says we are born sinners. Again, this is their arguments. We're born sinners, Psalms. And you could put conceived sinners there, but I use the word born because the next blank there is going to be conceived, and Psalm 58 uses the word born. And of course, I would put it with quotations, but you get the idea. That's what they believe. All right, let's go to Ezekiel 18, and let's talk about, I'm falling behind, aren't I? Ezekiel 18, and let's talk about some texts that would disprove very clearly and strongly, I believe, this teaching of total depravity. Ezekiel 18. We're going to use our Bibles, I tell you what. Ezekiel 18, passage after passage after passage. Beginning in verse 19. Again, in order to believe in original sin, and if you're studying with someone about this, you might even ask them. In order to believe in original sin, that would mean, therefore, that we inherited that sin from Adam on down the line, correct? We get it from mom and dad, and they're going to say every time, absolutely. That has to be the case. Where else would you get that sin? And so it's inherited. Well, look at Ezekiel 18 and verse 19. Yet you say, why? Doth not the Son bear the iniquity or the sin of the Father? When the Son hath done that which is lawful and right, and hath kept all my statutes, and hath done them, he shall surely live. Notice verse 20. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. But if the wicked will turn away from all his sins that he's committed, and keep my statutes and do that which is lawful and right, he shall surely live, he shall not die. Very plain and clear. The Son does not what? Bear the iniquity of the Father. It doesn't work that way, nor does the Father, if someone would believe that way, nor does the Father inherit the sin of the Son. You are judged on judgment for your sin and your deeds and what you did, period. No one else's. You do not inherit sin. Very plain and clear. And so the Bible teaches that sin is not inherited there, the first blank. All right, Matthew chapter 18. You probably remember this without turning to it. Jesus, before his disciples, tells them, he grabs someone, puts that someone in front of him and says, you need to become like this person. What was it or who was it that Jesus placed in front of him as a model? A child. He tells his disciples, you need to become like this child. Question, if a child is a sinner, what was Jesus trying to tell his disciples? What's that? Y'all need to get out there and sin. That's right. That doesn't even make sense. And I know the context is about humility, but again, Jesus is telling them, you need to be like this child, humble like this child. He's innocent, in other words. There is no sin in that child. You need to become like him. And by the way, he also mentions there, be converted like this child. When you go to 1 Peter, or excuse me, not 1 Peter, it's Peter talking, Acts chapter 3 and about verse 19, I believe it is, he tells the Jews there, repent and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out. When we talk about conversion, we're talking about salvation. And so if they're to become converted and be like this child, we're talking about being without sin, not being in sin. Ezekiel 28, let's turn to this one. If you didn't turn to Matthew, you're still in Ezekiel. If not, I'll give you a moment to get back there. Ezekiel 28 and verse 15. We're talking about the king of Tyre here. Ezekiel 28 and verse 15. Not Satan, as many would like to have us believe. The anointed cherub here. The king of Tyre. Ezekiel 28 and verse 15. Someone read that one for us that's willing.
Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee.
Excellent. The king of Tyre was what? Until iniquity was found in him? Perfect. What is Ezekiel, or God rather, through Ezekiel's hand, telling us about the king of Tyre? He was sinless. He did not have any sin until iniquity was found in him. We're going to see more and more when that is in just a moment. We've already talked about it a little bit. Stan mentioned it and was exactly right. Until you, of course, have that knowledge. So the blank there, the king of Tyre, he was perfect until sin was found in him. Any one of these passages is enough, at least in my opinion. I would submit that any of these is enough to disprove original sin. But we're just going to see, hopefully, how clear and obvious this is. Ezekiel 28:15. All right, let's go on to the next one. What about Hebrews chapter 2? Let's go to Hebrews chapter 2. This is where we talk a little more about this Jesus. Jesus, of course, was born of a woman. We've already noted that he obviously didn't inherit sin from her. He was without sin. But Hebrews 2, look at verse number 14 beginning. And this passage really is leading us to Isaiah 7. That's our main text. But this is kind of a preface to make sure there's no doubt that Jesus was born of man. Hebrews 2:14. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. God became flesh, Jesus Christ, and went through what flesh and blood goes through. Verse 15, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of who? Abraham. The seed of Abraham, the blank there, Abraham. He was of the seed of Abraham. He was literally a man who came God who came in the flesh and became a man and was born of Mary, of the seed of Abraham. Verse 17 then, wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in all things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. All right, Jesus was born of the seed of Abraham. Now with that in mind, I want you to go to Isaiah 7. Isaiah chapter 7. Give your finger some exercise. Isaiah 7. Now look at verse 14 with me when you get there. We're very familiar with verse 14, but we may not always go on and read the next two verses. And they are, and especially in this study, very, very important. Isaiah 7:14. I'll give you another moment. I hear pages still being turned, which is fantastic. Isaiah 7 and verse 14. All right, therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Who are we referencing here? Jesus, of course, no doubt about it. Now look at verse 15. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. Verse 16, for before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. Jesus was born of woman, of the seed of Abraham. He was a man. And yet, it says here, true or false, as a child, there was a time frame in which Jesus did not know right from wrong. Isn't that what it says? Absolutely. Think about that for a moment. When Jesus was a child, is it possible that he may have done something he shouldn't have done? Maybe thought something he shouldn't have thought, said something he shouldn't have said. Maybe he did something he didn't understand or know about.
Didn't do his chores, and Mama had to bring him to get his attention.
That's right. Maybe he didn't do a chore. Now, I don't know about some of this Apocrypha stuff where Jesus, where he killed someone for taking his ball. They were playing ball outside, and he killed someone as a child. I don't remember which part of the Apocrypha that's in, but I don't necessarily think that that's literal, but...
And resurrected him.
Yeah, right, and then resurrected him, right. But Jesus was a child. He was a man just like anyone else. And there was a time when he did not know right from wrong. And during that time, he was a child just as much as we were children. And he did things just like any other child would have done. But did he sin? Even if he did wrong as a child, he didn't sin. Why? Because he didn't know the difference. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not telling you that I know that Jesus did wrong as a child. But what I am saying is that there was a time that he didn't know right from wrong. He really was truly the seed of Abraham, a man, a human being, just as much as he was God. And again, remember that the powers that he received from God did not come until his baptism. In John chapter 1, when he received the Holy Spirit at age 30. And so until he was 30 years old, he was very, very much a man. And even then at 30, he was a man, but he had the Spirit.
He was a youth up until then.
That's right. He was a youth up until then. That's exactly right. Very true. In fact, we don't know anything before age 30 except one incident when he was how old? 12. At 12, we know he was already about his father's work at 12, but his baptism and his fulfilling righteousness didn't happen until the age of 30. Now, don't get excited if you're under 30 and think you're not accountable for sin because of that, but there is certainly a lot to be said about that. But Jesus...
We know that we've not told everything that he did, because if we did,
That's right.
world wouldn't hold the book.
That's right. The world wouldn't even hold the books. The amount of information that would have been written down to cover everything that he did. Yeah.
It was a constant thing in his life.
We know at least at the latest he was 12 when he started this ministry, and it went on for 15 years at least until he left this world around age 33. And so Jesus here's the point. In order to teach original sin, to believe in total depravity, you've got some problems when it comes to Jesus Christ, because he was born of woman. And if you want to say Mary was an immaculate conception as well, let's go to Mary's mom and on down the line. You're going to have issues. That means we've got 5 minutes. We've got 2 more passages. I think we're gonna get done just all right. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 39. Let's go there next. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 39. Just as proof, and I use this one to prove that total depravity again is not biblical, but also to give another idea of the age of accountability. Some might say, well, it's 30 because Jesus was 30 when he was baptized. No, not at all. Deuteronomy 29 would give, 1 and verse 39 rather, would give an even earlier age. Somebody read Deuteronomy 1:39 and tell us what's going on here. Doesn't have to be the person that reads it that tells us what's going on, but anybody read it and then we'll discuss it.
Moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be the victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there, and I will give it, and they shall possess it.
Excellent. True or false, when the spies came back and gave the bad report and they all cried out, Israel was told by God that they would not inherit the promised land. Those people in that generation. All right? What age were those adults, what age and up, were not able to go to the promised land? 20. So based on this passage and others, what happened to everyone who was 19 and under when that happened? Yeah, the 20 and older died, but those that were 19 and under, they lived, and they got to go into the promised land. Why? Why did God let those 19 and under go into the promised land? Because they were what? They had no knowledge of sin. They didn't know right from wrong. So God's age of accountability there is 20. And I'm not telling you that's His age today, or, it's based on maturity, but that's what God decided would be the best place to draw that line. Maybe there were some 19-year-olds that just weren't very capable and ready to really know right from wrong. And you and I both know at 19, we weren't near as wise as, well, I'm 27, that's as high as I can go right now. But, you get, looking back, I did a lot of silly things, but I'm not saying you're not accountable at 19, but you get the idea. Certainly a practical number God would give. Under 20, you can go on. They didn't have a knowledge of right and wrong. And so again, this concept of total depravity just doesn't fit the text. Any thoughts on that particular passage?
It's a good passage.
What is the age of accountability?
When you know right from wrong.
Okay, good. That's it. It's different for everybody. Is it possible? Is it possible that a 12-year-old could be accountable for sin? Sure. Right? I get that, we sometimes say we baptize them too young, and I get that. We need to, just because a child says, I want to be baptized, doesn't mean he or she is ready. I get that. But it is possible that a 12-year-old is accountable for sin. And that would be based upon...
In the newspaper, hear it on the news, 12-year-olds commit adult crimes.
Well, that's true.
Against other people.
That's true.
And, that tells us that God knew what He was talking about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Always, right? Rodney? It could be younger than 12. It has nothing to do with age, does it?
For myself, because I remember one time when my parents bought me a pair of walkie-talkies, and I was running around there saying some things I shouldn't have been saying, and there was a neighbor that heard me over his radio, and he knew who I was. He went to my dad, and I tell you what, I knew.
You knew what was wrong. There, really, for a child to be ready, there are three things he or she must know. One is wrong, what's sin, evil, needs to know and understand sin. Number two, he or she needs to understand what? What did Philip preach? What did everybody need to know before they could be baptized? The gospel. The gospel is ultimately summed up in the death, burial, and resurrection of who? Christ. So they've got to understand Jesus. They've got to know sin. They've got to know who Jesus is, who He was, what He did, and understand sin and what that means, that you're hurting God and that you're separated from Him. And then in the third place, they need to know about the what? The kingdom, the church. They need to understand the church, that there's one and that you're part of that in the body and that you've got work to do. And if those three things are true, then you've got somebody who's probably accountable. Yes, ma'am? Oh, good. Yes. That's very important. That's part of knowing Jesus, isn't it? Is the Son of God. That's very true. They've got to understand what that means, the virgin birth. That's a very good point. Yes, sir. The second bell hadn't gone yet, has it?
No.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you know if there's a Jewish ceremony that says this person is now an adult?
You talking about like bar mitzvah? Yeah. Is it 13? Yeah. Yeah, they go through their bar mitzvah when they, and it's, I guess it's that age for every child. It doesn't matter about what they know or don't know. It's when they're 13 years old. And I don't know a whole lot about that process, but yes, sir.
What does that mean? They're what?
I guess to the Jewish mind, it means that they're adults, right? I don't know a lot about the bar mitzvah. I've never, is that pretty much it? Yeah. I mean, that's the way I understood it too. And they think that they're adults at that point. That's the 13 years old. Our time is up, so let me just mention this last one. We won't turn to it. David couldn't bring his baby back, but could go to him. That is probably my favorite passage of all, and I saved it for last. I didn't even get to talk about it really. But David's baby was taken by God because of his sin, and David said, I can't have that baby come back and be with me, but I can go to be with him. And that last blank, certainly David was not talking about wanting to go to where? Hell. He wasn't wanting to go to hell to be with his baby. He was implying by inspiration that baby was in heaven and he was going to be there with it. And the good news in conclusion, all these aborted babies, and it's awful, it's murder, but the good news is every one of those children are where? They're in heaven. They're in heaven with God, or they will be on judgment. They're in paradise awaiting that. Thank you guys so much for your good attention.
You're going to have to prepare it a little better, I guess.
I know it.
Like Larry, you don't prepare enough.
I don't.